let's go to this point that I feel is very interesting, because you have put two things. You was speaking about attention and perception, no? So you say until now that interception cannot be changed clearly through mindfulness and through other contemplative practice. But what about proprioception? What about the perception of ourselves? What about that?
Yeah, well, before I get to that, let me just give one example, because I said I would give one example of this kind of flexibility. One of the honors in my life that I've had is to spend quite a bit of time with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And one of the things that you see with the Dalai Lama is his what I think of as his dynamic range of emotion, that is the capacity to switch from one emotion to another, is greater than in any human being I've ever met. And what do I mean by that? Well, I have seen situations where a person describes a tragic event to His Holiness, like Tibetans being tortured, and he's visibly crying in sadness in response to this. And in the next moment, literally just a few seconds later, he notices something funny and bursts out laughing. And the capacity to switch from one emotion to another, from going from crying to laughing, is something that we see in infants, but we almost never see that in adults. And this is really the kind of flexibility that is afforded by extraordinary awareness that His Holiness has cultivated. And Koncha, you were asking about what specific practices. Well, the kind of practice that His Holiness the Dalai Lama does the most of is analytic meditation, where he is interrogating the nature of the self, if you will. And examining what the properties are of the self, and ultimately deeply understanding the emptiness of the self and the emptiness of all phenomena. That is, the phenomena don't have intrinsic nature. The nature is afforded or constructed by our own minds. And being able to experientially glimpse this through analytic meditation affords a tremendous liberation and flexibility and decreases the likelihood that we'll get stuck.
Let's go to translate this and continue. Bueno, cuando estábamos hablando de las prácticas contemplativas que otorgaban la flexibilidad, Davidson quiere poner un ejemplo. El ejemplo es Su Santidad el Dalai Lama, que él ha visto que es una persona que tiene un rango dinámico de emociones, un espectro de emociones como no ha visto en nadie. Él ha visto como, por ejemplo, en un momento la gente le cuenta historias terribles del Tíbet, de tortura, de muertes, de tristeza, y obvio él se pone a llorar, pero nada, un tiempito muy corto más tarde alguien le cuenta algo divertido y se pone a reír. Esa capacidad de cambiar del llanto a la risa en adultos es muy rara, pero en los niños está completamente presente esta capacidad de tener awareness. Y si me preguntas exactamente cuál es la práctica que otorga este awareness, cuál es la práctica que él hace, por ejemplo, tenemos que hablar de la meditación analítica. La meditación analítica se interroga sobre la naturaleza del ser, se ponen preguntas y va deconstruyendo el self hasta llegar a elementos como la vacuidad. Entonces reflexiona sobre que el self es un fenómeno de la construcción de la mente, y esto te otorga muchísima más flexibilidad. I was thinking in just in the analytic meditation, also the Jung work about psychoanalytic and this dynamic method to interrogate their self, or Martin Buber, or different psychoanalysis, no? Also, William James has been using a method to interrogate ourselves, isn't it?
Yes, I think that there are all these commonalities that you point out, like Jung and William James and a number of other important psychologists. Cognitive therapy in the work of Aaron Beck also is very similar in offering methods to interrogate our mind in this way that can really be helpful. So yes, I very much agree.
La pregunta es si esto que nos está contando me suena al método psicoanalítico de Jung, también el trabajo de Martin Buber o de William James. Él dice, sí, claro, Jung, James, otros psicólogos también, Aaron Beck en la terapia cognitiva comportamental nos ofrecen métodos para interrogar a la mente. So one question that I don't want to forget, Richie, what about proprioception? How we can train the proprioception through analytic meditation?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't know that we really have an answer to how we can train proprioceptive awareness. Proprioceptive awareness is awareness of the body and um, feedback from the body, whereas interoception is perception of autonomic changes, changes like in our heart rate and respiration. I think that awareness practices probably are a reasonable way to improve our proprioceptive capacity. Although, to the best of my knowledge, this is something that really hasn't been tested explicitly.
Maybe we need to go back to Varela, to the phenomenology, and understand that all don't need to be tested, just to try, no? Because Varela, well, Umberto Maturana, many other phenomenologists are speaking about just about proprioception on this field, no? What do you remember from Varela of that?
Yeah, there is a one of the things that we can derive from Varela's work that has been taken into more modern neuroscience is to think about two ways of perceiving the self. We can think about an experiential self and a narrative self. And the experiential self is where we become aware of the proprioceptive aspects. The narrative self is conceptual. It's the conceptual representation of the self. And when we do contemplative practice, many forms of contemplative practice involve transitioning from the narrative self to the experiential self. And this is something important, and this is something that can help to strengthen our proprioceptive awareness.
Yeah, that's super interesting because that means that the analytic meditation or, for example, the emptiness meditation is just this transition in between the narrative experience, the narrative and the experience of the self, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Qué bueno.
Yeah.
Sí, bueno, volviendo un poco a la cuestión de la propiocepción, hemos visto que la interocepción no tenemos mucho juego, pero ¿qué pasa con la propiocepción? Él dice primero, desde la perspectiva de la neurociencia clásica, es aquella conciencia del cuerpo y no tenemos muchas experiencias sobre esto. Le he sugerido, quizás tenemos que volver a la fenomenología y recordar cosas que dijo Varela, aunque no estén probadas desde la ciencia. Sí, responde, Varela nos dijo algo muy interesante, por ejemplo, que había dos maneras de percibir al self. Uno era el self experiencial y otro es el self narrativo. El experiencial, que tiene que ver con los aspectos de la propiocepción, y el narrativo, que tiene que ver con los aspectos conceptuales de quién soy yo. Claramente las prácticas contemplativas lo que nos ofrecen es una transición entre la narrativa de quién soy yo hacia la experiencia de los aspectos de cómo me vivencio a mí mismo. Y esa transición es muy interesante. What happened in this transition? That we change the way that we perceive ourselves and we change our narrative through that?
You mean in the transition from the narrative self to the experiential self?
Sí, yes.
Well, neuroscientifically, we think that it has something to do with um, reconfiguring the connectivity between the default mode network of the brain and other networks. The narrative self is likely mediated through the default mode. The default mode is a mode of brain function that operates when we're not doing any other kind of demanding task. It's the mode that we revert to. And in most people, it's our narrative self. That is the mode that we revert to when there's not much else happening. And when we transition from the narrative self to the experiential self, we are decreasing the connectivity of the default mode so that it no longer is sort of hijacking the rest of the brain. There are still thoughts that are occurring and so forth, but they're not capturing our attention in the same way. And we can become aware of the proprioceptive qualities of our body. And that's entering what we normally think of as an experiential mode. And there are other brain networks that become more prominent, such as the salience network. The salience network is a network that is very important in detecting things that are important, which are typically emotional events, but also feelings in our body. And one neural structure, which is a key node in the salience network, is a structure that we call the insula. And the insula is a piece of cortex that is part of the posterior frontal lobe. And it is the only part of our body, of our brain, that has a map of our body, a viscerotopic map of the body. And so this is this is part of what we think of as the experiential self, and it is non-conceptual, and it's a way for the brain to represent bodily signals that are occurring, both interoceptive signals as well as proprioceptive signals.
So the insula is responsible about this process of the visceral map of our experience.
Yes, very much so.
Oh, thank you. Let's go to translate. Bueno, la pregunta sería ¿qué pasa entre ese estado experiencial y ese estado narrativo? Lo que sucede, responde, es que cuando nosotros hacemos prácticas para pasar de lo narrativo a lo experiencial y de lo experiencial a lo narrativo, estamos reconfigurando nuestro piloto automático en el cerebro. La narrativa es un piloto automático, una manera que nosotros tenemos de contarnos quiénes somos automáticamente y no tener que recontárnoslo cada vez, ¿no? Esta transición de la narrativa a lo experiencial lo que hace es decrecer la fuerza de ese piloto automático, no nos prestamos atención entonces de la manera que solemos prestarnos, y aunque surjan pensamientos y cosas que son inevitables, podemos ir al cuerpo. Y en ese cuerpo nosotros entramos más en una red celular que tiene mucha más responsabilidad en los sentimientos. Y dentro de esa red celular que tiene tanta importancia en los sentimientos, encontramos la ínsula como la parte del cerebro que se encarga de mapear nuestro cuerpo visceral, un cuerpo que se construye a través de las experiencias no conceptuales. La ínsula recibe señales desde la interocepción y desde la propiocepción. What kind of practice promote the activation of the insula, and what kind of practice decrease the activation of the insula?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We know that compassion practices increase activation of the insula. There are, so that's something we know. There may be also certain kinds of awareness practices that increase activity in the insula. Um, uh, uh, when we do an awareness practice and our mind wanders, and then we bring our mind back, uh, the the moment we notice that our minds have been lost, there typically is activation in the insula, which is again part of the salience network. And so the capacity of our minds to know what we're doing is really part of this quality that we call meta-awareness. And meta-awareness in part involves the insula. It involves many other parts of the brain as well, but the insula plays a role in noticing when we've gone astray.
Excelente. La pregunta es, ¿qué prácticas promueven la activación de la ínsula o la desactivación de la misma? Seguro, una de las prácticas que lo promueve es la compasión. La compasión promueve la activación positiva de la ínsula y también el prestar conciencia a lo que está sucediendo. Un ejemplo de ello es cuando la mente se va, cuando la mente vagabundea y de repente la volvemos a llevar al presente, eso activa la ínsula. Y es que saber que nosotros estamos haciendo algo y reconocemos que lo estamos haciendo, la capacidad de hacer meta-awareness, metacognición, activa la ínsula. So, going to one of the important questions that we has been prepared is that was the number 5 is what is the difference, no, how we can transform a normal state in an altered state of consciousness, what factor contribute to a state becoming altered, and how this happen, this transformation in between a normal state and an altered state of consciousness. ¿Cuáles son los factores que contribuyen a que un estado normal de conciencia se transforme en un estado alterado de conciencia? You know many things about that.
Well, yeah, there's a lot to say about this. And one other piece, which was not explicit in the question, but is very important, and that is that when we engage in contemplative practice, we are practicing not so much for the experience we have when we're practicing, but for how that practice affects our everyday life. How does it affect our relationships, our interactions, our demeanor when we're with others? And that is really about how the altered state becomes an altered trait or a more enduring characteristic of our consciousness. So, to say it a different way, when we meditate, we don't meditate for the experience we have when we put our butts on the cushion. We meditate because it affects our everyday life. What I would say there is that we have learned a lot from research on skill acquisition, how we acquire a skill. And what we know is that in order to acquire a skill, and here it's appropriate to talk about well-being as a skill. This is something that I frequently talk about. Well-being is not typically regarded as a skill, but all of the research that we and other scientists have done leads us to this conclusion. And what that means is that we can practice these skills, and through repetition, practice repeatedly over and over, that the state becomes a trait. It's something that becomes more enduring and spontaneous, so that it arises in all contexts, particularly in challenging situations, in difficult situations. So this is something really, really important. And basically, the research shows that in order for changes in the brain to become more enduring, we need to practice. And the research shows that what's most important is regularity of practice initially, not so much the length of practice. And so, for example, we have research showing that people who've never meditated before, many of whom don't even know about meditation, if they're part of a research study where they learn to meditate and they meditate for just 5 minutes a day, that is enough to produce an enduring change if they do it every day. And one of the questions that I ask people is, I'm sure everyone on this webinar brushes their teeth every day. And when humans first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And the research shows that if we spent even as little time each day that we spend brushing our teeth, nourishing our mind and our heart, this world would really be a different place.
Exactamente. Thank you, Richie. Bueno, vamos a hablar más sobre cuál es la diferencia entre un estado alterado de conciencia y los rasgos alterados de la conciencia, porque esto es muy importante. En las prácticas contemplativas nosotros no meditamos simplemente para tener una experiencia fantástica en el cojín y decir, wow, qué bueno, sino para observar cómo la práctica consecutiva de esta experiencia afecta a los hábitos de nuestra vida, a nuestras interacciones, a nuestras relaciones. Entonces no meditamos por la experiencia, sino para observar cómo esto afecta alterando los trazos de nuestra conciencia. Esto es muy importante. Como la meditación lo que hace es, nos permite adquirir habilidades. Cualquier tipo de habilidad que se quiera adquirir requiere práctica. Yo a menudo digo que el bienestar es una habilidad y llamamos habilidad a todo aquello que se practica repetitivamente. Si nosotros meditamos, estamos alterando los trazos del estado de nuestra conciencia sin forzar repetitivamente. Y eso significa que cuando se presente una situación podemos dar una respuesta completamente diferente de la que lo hubiéramos dado sin tener estos rasgos alterados. Estos rasgos alterados, para que se transformen, se mantengan, no necesitamos mucho, necesitamos prácticas muy breves, por ejemplo, no más de 5 minutos diarios. A menudo habéis oído que digo que es como lavarse los dientes. Nosotros no nacimos en este planeta lavándonos los dientes, pero si cada día dedicamos 5 minutos a esa analogía de meditar como lavarnos los dientes, pues podemos tener estos cambios, estos rasgos alterados.